I asked her what was wrong. She said everything, then leaned closer, letting me stay. The afternoon had that soft, golden haze that made the edges of everything seem gentler, warmer. I noticed her before I even realized I was looking for her. Her presence carried a subtle weight today, something quieter, slower than usual. She sat in her usual corner of the living room, the sunlight falling across her hair, catching hints of chestnut and silver that shimmered like fine threads. She stirred her coffee absently, the spoon tracing the rim of the cup again and again, each rotation deliberate, yet aimless, as though the movement alone could anchor her thoughts. Her posture was different, too. Normally, she would sit upright, exuding that quiet confidence she carried effortlessly, shoulders back, gaze alert. But today, there was a slight slump to her shoulders, a softness in her movements that seemed to suggest she was carrying something heavier than the day itself. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with a quiet ache of empathy. I wanted to ask, to bridge the distance, but the hesitancy lingered. There is a fine line between concern and intrusion, and I didn't want to cross it. I took a seat nearby, careful to leave enough space so she wouldn't feel cornered. Even at a distance, I could feel the subtle tension in the room, like static electricity between two cautious magnets. Her fingers tapped lightly against the cup, and I realized the motion wasn't rhythmic, it was anxious, almost like she was trying to measure time by it, trying to ground herself in something solid. The soft hum of the air conditioner, the muted ticking of the wall clock, and the faint aroma of coffee and vanilla from the candles she liked to light, these small details became amplified, like the world had slowed down to match her quiet turmoil. When she finally looked up, our eyes met for a brief second. There was that familiar spark, that connection that always lingered in shared silences, but it was shadowed by a fleeting vulnerability I had rarely seen. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't quite find the words. Her gaze drifted away again, resting on nothing in particular, the edge of the window, the fading light, the invisible weight of something unsaid. I could feel it in the way her chest rose and fell unevenly, in the subtle tightening of her jaw, in the quiet tremor of her fingers brushing the rim of the cup. I wanted to reach out, to offer comfort without forcing conversation. It wasn't about giving advice or solving whatever was inside her, it was simply about being there. The tension in the room was heavy, yet delicate, fragile in a way that made every glance, every shift of her body, speak louder than words ever could. Her presence alone demanded attention, commanded care, and I felt a pull toward her that wasn't just curiosity, it was a quiet, instinctive desire to bridge the unspoken gap. Even in her quietness, she radiated a soft magnetism that was hard to ignore. The warmth of the sunlight on her skin, the subtle scent of her perfume mixed with the faint vanilla, the way her hair caught the light, all of it made the ordinary moment feel intimate, suspended in a time that only existed between us. I remained still, breathing slowly, allowing the room to absorb both our presences, letting her feel that I was there, silently attentive, ready to offer any closeness she might need. It was in that quiet tension, in the space between gestures and glances, that the story began, not with words, but with the fragile awareness of her distance, and my quiet determination to stay close. I stayed where I was for a while, watching the subtle shifts in her expression, the way her fingers lingered along the edge of the coffee cup, the quiet exhale that seemed to carry the weight of the world. I wanted to speak, to ask gently if she was okay, but the words hung in my throat. There's always that delicate balance, how to reach out without crowding, how to offer comfort without breaking the fragile walls she had built around herself. Finally, I shifted slightly, enough to signal presence without intruding. "Are you, all right?" My voice was quiet, almost tentative, like stepping lightly across a fragile surface. She didn't look up immediately. The silence stretched, and in it, I could feel her hesitation like a current running through the room. She seemed suspended between wanting to respond and retreating further into her thoughts. When she finally met my gaze, it was brief, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't name, a mixture of fatigue, vulnerability, and something deeper, a quiet longing for understanding. There was a pause, a pregnant pause where the room seemed to hold its breath. Her lips pressed together lightly, and I noticed the subtle tension in her jaw. She exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if releasing a part of the weight she carried, but not enough to let it go entirely. I could see the faint tremor in her hand as she reached for her cup again. Even in something as small as that motion, there was a story unfolding, a narrative of quiet struggle, of private battles waged silently. I wanted to say more, to offer words that might make her feel less alone, but the right words didn't exist yet. Sometimes, being close without forcing conversation is more powerful than any sentence. I shifted just a little closer, careful, almost unconscious of the small act. The subtle movement seemed to register. She glanced at me again, this time holding my gaze a fraction longer. Her eyes softened briefly, the tension in her body easing just a fraction. That small, unspoken acknowledgement, it was a signal that I was allowed to be here, that my presence wasn't unwelcome. She didn't speak, but the slight incline of her head, the faint relaxing of her shoulders, told me everything I needed to know. She needed space, but not complete distance. I felt the quiet pull between us, the delicate tension that seemed to vibrate in the air. It wasn't about words, it was about proximity, about silent reassurance. About being steady when everything else felt unsteady. I imagined the warmth of my hand near hers, the comfort of a presence that didn't demand anything in return. She seemed to sense it too, because the tremor in her hand lessened slightly, her breathing slowed, and her gaze drifted to the sunlight filtering through the window. For a moment, the world outside didn't exist, the noise, the distractions, the weight of everything she carried, they all faded into the background. And in that stillness, that fragile quiet, I understood something important. Connection isn't always about immediate comfort or conversation. Sometimes, it's about waiting, about letting someone feel your presence, letting them know, without a single word, that they aren't alone. It was a small step, a subtle acknowledgement of her vulnerability, but it was enough. Enough for her to feel a glimmer of trust. Enough for me to know that if I waited patiently, the walls she held around her might begin to shift, just slightly, in my direction. The room remained quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock and the soft hum of the air conditioner. I could feel the tension lingering in the space between us, fragile yet insistently present. She hadn't moved closer, but she hadn't pulled away either. It was as if the air itself carried her hesitation, the unspoken weight of thoughts she didn't yet have the words to release. I stayed still, breathing slowly, careful not to disturb the delicate balance. Finally, her gaze met mine again. This time, it lingered longer, searching, tentative, as if she were weighing whether it was safe to let her guard down. There was a vulnerability there I hadn't seen before, subtle yet undeniable. Her lips parted slightly, then closed, then parted again, as if the words were on the edge of leaving her mouth. And then she said it, softly, almost a whisper, everything. The single word hung in the air, heavier than any sentence could have been. It wasn't dramatic or exaggerated, it was quiet, intimate, raw. I could see the tremor in her hands, the slight pull of her shoulders inward, the way her chest rose and fell unevenly. She wasn't looking at me directly anymore, her eyes had drifted downward, but the weight of her words reached across the space, brushing against me, calling for acknowledgement. I felt a sudden impulse to reach for her, but I paused, remembering the careful balance of closeness and respect we had been building. Instead, I let my presence speak. I shifted slightly closer, a subtle movement meant to reassure rather than crowd. She noticed, because her head lifted just a fraction, her eyes meeting mine with a flicker of something fragile, a mix of relief, fear, and a quiet curiosity of someone beginning to trust. There was a brief, suspended silence. I didn't rush to fill it with words. Sometimes, the most profound comfort comes from simply being there. Her fingers brushed lightly against her cup, then rested in her lap, and I imagined the way her hand might feel if it were near mine, warm, tentative, seeking connection. The vulnerability in her posture was magnetic, drawing me closer without a single word. I spoke softly, careful to match her tone. I'm here. Not as a solution, not as someone to fix her, but as someone willing to share the weight of her moment. She didn't respond immediately, but the way her body relaxed just slightly, the faint easing of tension in her shoulders, told me she had heard the sincerity behind the words. The intimacy of the moment wasn't loud or dramatic, it was in the small things, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the way her gaze met mine then softened, the quiet acceptance that she could allow someone to witness her fragility. It was the kind of trust that doesn't demand explanation, the kind that grows quietly in shared silences and unspoken understanding. For the first time in the afternoon, she leaned just a fraction closer, her presence brushing against mine, and I felt the warmth of proximity, the quiet steadiness of someone letting themselves be seen. And in that moment, I understood that this was the start of something delicate and profound, an intimacy born not from grand gestures, but from quiet acknowledgement and the courage to say, simply, everything. After she admitted it, everything, the room felt heavier, yet somehow softer, as if her words had reshaped the air around us. I remained still, not moving too quickly, not speaking too soon. Comfort isn't always in words, sometimes it's in the simple act of being present, of allowing someone to feel steady without demanding explanation. She shifted slightly, just enough for her shoulder to brush against mine, tentative and almost accidental. I didn't flinch. I stayed rooted, letting the warmth of my presence meet hers quietly. Her head dropped slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might retreat into herself again. But instead, she leaned just a fraction closer, as though testing the waters, letting me share the space without verbal invitation. I felt the subtle shift of weight, the faint warmth of her hair grazing my arm, the gentle rhythm of her breathing mingling with mine. It wasn't dramatic, it was small, almost imperceptible, but in it, there was a profound trust. I adjusted my posture slightly, careful to create a subtle barrier of safety without crowding her. The quiet of the room wrapped around us like a soft blanket, the hum of the air conditioner, the distant sounds of life beyond the window, and the faint ticking of the clock became a backdrop to the delicate intimacy unfolding. Every breath she took, every slight motion, felt amplified in the stillness. I could feel the soft rise and fall of her shoulder against mine, the warmth of her proximity, the small weight of her presence asserting itself in a way that demanded acknowledgement. She didn't speak. There were no grand declarations, no confessions, only the quiet gravity of her trust, the kind that allows someone to lean in and simply exist beside you. Her fingers, once restless around the cup, now rested gently in her lap, and I imagined how it might feel if our hands brushed, if I could offer reassurance through touch alone. The room held its breath with us, and for the first time, I felt the quiet magic of shared silence, the space where emotions could be understood without a single word. Her eyelids fluttered slightly, a subtle release of tension, and I felt my own chest loosen in response. Sometimes comfort is reciprocal, you give it, and in doing so, you receive it back in unexpected ways. I could sense her heartbeat, steady yet tentative, and in that rhythm, there was a language beyond words, a dialogue of presence, of shared understanding, of unspoken connection. I reached out slowly, a simple, unobtrusive gesture, and brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She didn't pull away, instead, her head leaned just a touch closer. The faint warmth of her cheek near my chest, the subtle brush of her hair against my hand, and the quiet steadiness of her breathing against mine, all of it conveyed more than conversation ever could. I realized then that moments like this, the ones built on patience, presence, and subtle gestures, carry the deepest intimacy. We remained like that for a long stretch, not speaking, just existing together. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of trust, empathy, and the slow, undeniable pull of closeness. And in that gentle stillness, I knew this was the turning point, the moment where vulnerability and presence intertwined, creating a bond that words could never match. The quiet between us stretched comfortably, yet it was charged with the kind of tension that doesn't announce itself with words, it lingers in the air, in the faint warmth of proximity, in the steady rhythm of someone trusting you enough to be seen. After a long pause, her fingers twitched slightly, a subtle signal that she was ready to speak, even if only a little. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. It just feels like too much sometimes, she murmured, not meeting my eyes at first. The words were fragmented, heavy with unspoken layers, and I sensed the gravity behind each one. I didn't interrupt, I simply stayed still, letting her dictate the pace. The weight of my presence was meant to anchor her, a quiet reassurance that she didn't have to carry everything alone. She shifted slightly closer, and I noticed how the small movement changed the way the light caught her hair, brushing her cheek with golden strands. Her vulnerability radiated subtly, like warmth through a thin fabric. My hand hovered near hers, resting gently on the armrest between us, close enough for her to feel if she needed, but careful not to push. She took a slow breath, and this time, her eyes met mine, a flicker of trust reflected in the depth of her gaze. "I feel like I can't get anything right," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. It wasn't a plea, it was an offering, a quiet invitation to witness her inner struggle. I nodded softly, not with words, but with the language of presence, letting her know she was heard, that I understood without judgment. Her hand moved, almost imperceptibly, brushing against mine in the momentary accident of gesture. The contact was brief but electric in its subtlety, enough to communicate closeness without the need for words. I felt the warmth of her skin, the slight tension in her fingers, and the unspoken relief when she didn't withdraw. It was these small, fleeting touches, these quiet exchanges, that carried the emotional weight far deeper than any declaration could. She paused, staring into the fading sunlight, and then spoke again, softer this time, a whisper almost lost in the hum of the room. "Sometimes I just wish someone would just be here, and not try to fix me." Her words lingered in the space, delicate yet profound. I felt a pull toward her, not urgency, not desire, but a steady, grounding need to be the presence she sought. Without a word, I moved slightly closer, letting my shoulder graze hers, a subtle reassurance. She didn't flinch, if anything, she leaned into the proximity, a quiet acknowledgement that she trusted me enough to share the space with her. Her head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward mine, and I could feel the warmth of her breath, the soft, steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the unspoken bond forming in the silence. It was in this exchange, the ebb and flow of shared vulnerability, the gentle brush of skin, the slow, careful trust, that our connection deepened. We didn't need elaborate words or declarations. Each small gesture, each hesitant admission, each fleeting touch carried the weight of intimacy, the gravity of someone allowing themselves to be seen fully, without expectation. And in that quiet room, amidst fragmented confessions and the subtle language of presence, I realized that this was no longer just comfort. It was the beginning of something delicate, profound, and irrevocably ours. Her words had faded into a quiet murmur, but the weight of them lingered in the room. I could feel her hesitation, the tentative way she tested the space between us, still unsure how much closeness she could allow. I didn't speak immediately. Sometimes, the most powerful reassurance isn't in saying the right words, it's in showing steadiness, reliability, presence. I shifted just slightly, careful not to crowd her, and she leaned subtly toward me, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But I noticed. I felt the warmth radiating from her, the slight tension in her shoulders beginning to soften. Her hair brushed lightly against my arm, and in that delicate friction, I sensed both her fragility and the quiet trust she was offering. "Hey," I said softly, my voice calm, steady. "You're not alone in this." It wasn't a solution or a promise to fix anything. It was simply the acknowledgement that she could let her guard down, if only for a moment, and that she would be met with patience, not pressure. Her eyes flickered up, meeting mine, searching for sincerity. I offered a small, encouraging smile, careful not to overwhelm. The subtle exchange of glances held more meaning than any speech could convey. It was the quiet language of connection, acknowledgement, acceptance, reassurance. She exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and I noticed the tiniest easing of tension in her jaw, the faint release of breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. I reached out slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't recoil. Instead, she let her head tilt slightly, exposing the curve of her cheek to my hand, the warmth of her skin a gentle reminder of her trust. The gesture was fleeting but intimate, a tender reassurance without words. Her presence felt lighter now, not because the world outside had changed, but because she had allowed someone else to bear a fraction of the weight with her. I spoke again, quieter this time, letting each word settle slowly. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. It doesn't make you weak. Her lips curved into a faint, almost shy smile. It wasn't the dramatic release of tension, just a quiet acknowledgement, a subtle letting down of walls she had held so tightly. Her hand brushed briefly against mine, lingering just long enough to convey that she was ready to accept comfort. The warmth of her skin, the faint pressure of her fingers, and the gentle tremor in her hand spoke volumes. I felt my own heartbeat steady in response, the rhythm of proximity and trust sinking between us. For a moment, we stayed like that, not speaking, letting the room hold us, the sunlight casting a soft glow across her face. The tension of the earlier hours had softened into a warmth that neither of us needed to name. It was enough to simply exist here together, the quiet steadiness of my presence a promise she could lean on. In that gentle, unspoken exchange, I realized something important: tenderness isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it's in the small gestures, the brush of hair, the faint touch of fingers, the soft assurance in your voice. And when it's offered patiently and sincerely, it carries more weight than anything else. The room was filled with a soft, amber light, the kind of light that makes everything feel slower, gentler, suspended in a moment that exists only between breaths. I noticed her before I realized I was searching for her, her presence subtle yet unmistakable. She sat in her usual spot by the window, hands wrapped around a warm mug, staring out as if the world outside held some kind of answer. The curl of her fingers around the cup was gentle, almost absent-minded, and I could see the faint tremor in her knuckles, a small, silent signal that something was off. Her posture was different today. Normally, she carried herself with that quiet grace, shoulders back, spine straight, eyes alert and engaged. Today, there was a slight slump in her shoulders, a soft surrender to something unseen. Even the way she tilted her head, resting briefly against the window frame, suggested a quiet exhaustion, not physical, but the kind that settles deep in the chest. I felt a pull in my chest, a quiet ache, a mix of concern and the instinct to offer comfort without intruding. I lingered nearby, careful to give her space. The distance between us wasn't cold, it was measured, respectful, a quiet offering that I was here if she wanted it. The subtle sounds of the room became amplified, the hum of the air conditioner, the faint ticking of a clock, the soft scrape of her mug against the table. Each little detail seemed magnified by the slow, deliberate way she moved. Her eyes finally lifted, meeting mine for a fraction of a second. There was something there, a flicker of vulnerability I rarely saw. Her lips parted slightly, then pressed together again, as though she were considering whether to speak, whether to admit that weight she carried. She didn't speak yet, and I didn't push. Sometimes, the most profound connection is in patience, in the quiet acknowledgement that you are present and ready to listen when the moment comes. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume mingled with the warmth of coffee, and the way sunlight caught the strands of her hair, revealing subtle hints of chestnut and silver. It was ordinary and intimate all at once, a quiet tableau of someone allowing themselves to be partially seen. Every detail mattered, the soft rise and fall of her chest, the slight tremor of her fingers, the hesitant way she shifted her weight. In that delicate space between us, the story began, not with words, but with presence. The subtle tension, the quiet concern, the fragile distance, it was all part of a slow, unfolding intimacy. And I knew that if I stayed patient, if I remained steady and attentive, that distance could become the first bridge in something quietly profound.